Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode Around the Fire on Spirit Reflections. My name is Fred Gouveia, and for those of you that are here for the first time, Spirit Reflections is an ongoing conversation series, both in Portuguese and in English, about people's personal and spiritual journeys, the tools they found along the way, and how those tools shape who they are and the work that they do today. We interview artists, philosophers, scientists, religious people of all traditions to learn how they came into being and the insights that they discovered along the way. So, like and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. We're also on Spotify. So, if you're there, give us a review. We also have a website, spiritreflections.org, where you can sign up to receive our newsletter and get first a chance to attend our workshops and offerings that we have in the future. And so, with that, I'd like to introduce you to our guest for tonight's conversation on family constellations in prison and alchemical constellations. And it's Dan Booth Cohen. And I'm going to read you his bio here so we can have it memorialized for posterity. Dan's clinical practice specializes in helping individuals, couples, and families heal the effects of inherited trauma and fulfill their desires for having more love and deeper impact in their lives. He has a strong interest in healing generational trauma inherited from war, genocide, and the legacy of slavery. Combining a near encyclopedic knowledge of world history, mythology, and culture with an uncanny psychic awareness, Dan offers clients profound and transformative healing while expanding understanding and restoring peace of mind. Prior to obtaining a PhD in psychology and training with Bert Hellinger as a constellations facilitator, Dan was internationally known for his work in violence prevention and conflict resolution. A former strategic planning consultant for the director of the Los Alamos Laboratory, he pivoted away from weapons research to become a founding member of the City of Cambridge Peace Commission in 1981. For 40 years, he has dived deep to understand the origins of violent and hostile urges that darken the human heart. Since 2000, he has become a leading voice for incorporating personal, ancestral, and spirit consciousness into therapeutic practices. Dan Cohen holds a PhD in psychology from Saybrook University and an MBA from Boston University. He's the author of I Carry You in My Heart, Family Constellations in Prison, which I have right here on my desk, and numerous scholarly articles and book chapters. Dan has led Seeing with Your Heart workshops and training courses in 18 countries in Europe, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, South America, and throughout the United States. And I am proud to say that I am a graduate of many of his training programs, and I love it. I get so much out of them. And so I am personally humbled and honored to have him here around the fire on Spirit Reflections. So, Dan, welcome.
Wow, thanks, Fred. Thanks for that beautiful introduction, and I'm glad to be sitting around the fire with you and the other visitors that are viewing this.
Beautiful, Dan. I am very happy because Family Constellations came into my life over a few years ago, and I have found to be one of the most powerful tools for transformation and inner work. And I consider you to be an important authority in this field, and I have learned so much from you that when I read your book, I Carry You in My Heart, Family Constellations in Prison, which shows the many years that you worked with inmates in prison using family constellations, I was blown away. And that's how I got to know you, and the rest is history because we've been together in many of your trainings, and we just had one a few hours ago, and it was yet very powerful. And so I thank you for being here. And I wanted to start from the beginning, like we do in every episode on Spirit Reflections, Dan. Before we talk about family constellations and the work that you do today, I'd like to invite you to take us back in time to the beginnings of your childhood and the personal journey that got you to family constellations. So take us there, please.
Okay, thank you. So I was born in New York City in the 1950s, a Jewish family. Both my parents were born in the United States, but they were deeply impacted by the Jewish Holocaust in Europe. My father was a soldier in the United States Army and fought his way into Germany. And then after the war, he became the director of the United Nations camp for Jewish Holocaust survivors. And so this was very close to him and to my mother. And I was born just 10 years after the end of the war. And it was really in the atmosphere, being Jewish and also having survived through this threat that destroyed so many. And the villages where my grandparents, great-grandparents had come from, the ones that hadn't immigrated were in large part were killed, only a few survived. And this gave me a real desire to learn how to be a peacemaker, mostly out of fear. I was just afraid that people wanted to kill me, and I didn't understand why that might be. And I set out to discover how to be a peacemaker and try to resolve these issues. So I grew up in Manhattan, went to high school there. It was a very active time in the 60s and 70s of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. My school was in Harlem, so I was involved in civil rights and then the Black Power movement, and always interested in activism and changing the world. And so it became very easy for me after I graduated school and came into my adult life that I was always had a curiosity about not only the violence out in the world, but also the violence inside the human heart, because I had witnessed that from growing up in New York. It's a violent, angry place a lot of times. My father, who was a war veteran, had PTSD, which wasn't really diagnosed, but
Right.
He carried a lot of rage. And so it's become my life's work to look towards reconciliation and to understand the conflict and violence that grows from within and then expresses itself externally.
And then, was there a particular moment in your biography of childhood that you recall this sort of higher voice or inner guidance or intuition calling you to a metaphysical, religious, or spiritual place so that you could process or understand this context of the childhood that you described for us?
Well, it happened at different times. The atmosphere, the cultural atmosphere in New York at that time was a very secular, scientifically oriented. The belief at that time was that science and the understanding of scientific research had done away with the need for spirituality or religion. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who people might know, was a childhood friend.
Yep.
And
oh, wow.
And the attitude, stance that he takes, if people are familiar with his work, that we just live in a kind of material universe, and that science reveals a certain truth, and religion are kind of made up stories that are mostly off the mark. This is the way that I was raised, and then I just started having experiences that defied that reality, that just really challenged in different ways. I experienced a lot of synchronicities, serendipities. I found times that I knew things that I had no way of knowing. These were intermittent. It didn't happen consistently, but it would happen occasionally. And around the time I was 20 years old, I was in university, and I had some experiences that really shifted the ground for me, of having some types of epiphanies or hearing the voice of angels or guides speaking to me. And I was also at that time studying with a university professor who had studied Sir Isaac Newton and his research in alchemy. And part of what her research revealed was that this scientific materialist worldview that had come down over the centuries, that people are familiar with, that the Earth is a little speck of dust in an infinite universe, and evolution is purposeless and meaningless. It's just random iterations and mutations that out of a million of them, some have a benefit, and that those are the ones that move forward. That consciousness is created by the brain, and with no brain, there is no consciousness. So those kind of precepts. That that at the dawn of the scientific revolution and the creation of the Royal Society in England, that this was all a fabrication. It was not. There was no science behind it ever. It was never something that was discovered. It was just another made-up religion, basically modern religion that served a purpose at that time, but didn't have any research basis for it really whatsoever. And this is the education that I received from this professor was all laid out there, and it was a big awakening for me to recognize that that this scientific worldview itself was not scientific. And at the same time, like a lot of college students at that time, I was had some exposure to psychedelics and had some opportunities to expand my own awareness, and had other experiences that spoke to me and gave me the sense that there's more to the world than I might have been taught or was expected to know.
Dan, you mentioned that your professor did research into a book by Isaac Newton on alchemy.
Yes, that's
okay. Tell us a little bit more about that. I didn't even know he wrote a book on alchemy.
He actually, his alchemical papers were greater in volume than his other well-known scientific papers.
Wow.
He was born in 1650, I believe, or 1640, and at the end of his life, this materialist worldview had taken hold, and all of his alchemical papers were crated up, and they were hidden at Cambridge University. They were squirreled away, basically never to see the light of day again. And the science proceeded, this Newtonian worldview, which is what it's known as, proceeded for the centuries. But these crates were stored in the eaves of one of the buildings at Cambridge University. And in the 1920s,
wow,
they decided to repurpose the building, and they did some renovations up in that space, and they took the crates out. And the great English economist, John Maynard Keynes, who's the kind of the father of modern economics, was at Cambridge University, and he heard that these crates existed, and he insisted on being given access to them. And because of his status and stature, he could not be denied. And so during the 1930s and 40s, he cataloged these papers,
wow,
went through them, and cataloged them kind of as his spare time hobby. So he worked full time as an economist, but when he wanted to kind of wind down or relax on weekends and evenings, he went through these papers and cataloged them and created a catalog of all of them. And it's a tremendous volume. And then he died, I think, in the early 1950s. And then it was all put away again.
Wow.
Then I find this story really interesting. It's a little bit long. This professor was born in a small town in Arkansas, in eastern Arkansas, in a little town.
This economist who catalogs everything.
No, that's John Maynard Keynes.
Okay.
The professor who got access, who taught me at Northwestern. Okay. She was born in a little town. She went to the local college. She became a high school science teacher in her town. And it was a racially mixed town. It was mostly Black town. And so the high school she was teaching at was mostly Black students, though she was white. And when she got into her 40s, she suddenly had this feeling, irresistible feeling in her, that the world she was living with was too small, that it was a bigger world out there. And she decided she wanted to get a PhD in the history of science. And she was accepted to Cambridge University. And when she got there, I don't know the whole story, but she and another woman from Germany were given access to John Maynard Keynes' catalogs. And she was allowed to write her dissertation on these papers. There were only two academics at that time. So her and this other professor from Germany, academic, did their dissertation. So her name was Betty Jo Dobbs, and she completed her dissertation, and then she got this gig at Northwestern University and started teaching it.
Wow.
And so she was that was my access. She did the seminar, and each week she taught the course, and the course was basically that it was all made up, and that Newton was part of a much longer scientific tradition that dated all the way back to the Greeks and the Egyptians, the Indians, Hindus, the Chinese, the Buddhists, that this was actually the scientific tradition that existed over time from the Arabs and the Egyptian, the astronomy, and all the mathematics that came from the ancients, that Newton's alchemy was in that tradition. And then because of the English Civil War and the birth of global corporations and the starting of the British Empire, it just all got churned over in service to economics and the politics and the religion of the day. They needed an alternative religion to Christianity in order to be able to conquer foreign nations without having to be bound by the morals of religion. So they created a amoral theology that we live in a dead universe and nothing matters, nothing has purpose, there's no morality to it. So just grab the gold. Whoever gets the most gold wins. And it became the philosophy of the British Empire and allowed them basically to, without any kind of moral restraint, to do what they did in India, in China, Native Americans, Aboriginals in Australia, all through Africa. This became the science, and global corporations and empire all became joined. And this is our modern legacy.
So this professor of yours, in a way, kind of initiated you into an ancient wisdom that was pretty much sealed to groups of people that did all of this wisdom behind closed doors, in a way, right? It wasn't open
to
the secular masses, if you will.
Right. And the key that I took away from it was that alchemy was about transformation. And it always had two aspects. Transformation meant transformation at the physical plane and transformation at the spiritual plane. Alchemy became science, chemistry. Chemistry is only concerned with transformation on the physical plane. And the ultimate quest of alchemy was transformation, and transformation of materials became nuclear science. That a nuclear fission is the transformation of one element into another element. And when that occurs, there's a huge release of energy.
Right.
So half of the alchemical quest was solved with the discovery of nuclear fission, and eventually turned into the atom bomb.
Mm-hmm.
The other part, which had become separated, which is spiritual transformation, went into a long state of decay. And by the time I came to it in the 1970s, the threat of nuclear destruction was so imminent. It exists today. It seems to be out of the background, out of people's minds, more in the background, but the world is filled with immense amounts of nuclear weapons that could destroy humanity in a few minutes, a lot of life on the planet. And so I felt called to discover the other half of the alchemical quest. How do we do transformation, spiritual transformation, or transformation of the heart? And this is this has been my life's path for almost 50 years now.
And then this separation from the physical, the spiritual from the physical, it sounds to me like is what took place when the scientists replaced the theology of morals and put a set of amoral dogmas. In a way, that was kind of the separation that they engineered, right?
Yes, they basically they burned the wise women and hung them. They co-opted the mystics and displaced them. They wiped out indigenous wisdom wherever they found it. Any
Right.
pockets of indigenous wisdom were destroyed. And they created this materialist universe, which is only matter and energy moving around according to the so-called laws of physics. And that reality became the only reality that there is. And
Right.
non-local or non-physical reality, a more feminine type of reality, was destroyed.
Right. And so you are in the 70s when that takes place, when that finds you.
Mm-hmm.
And where do you take this information at next?
Well, I continued my studies. I before I graduated, I did a senior thesis about nuclear weapons and that history. I studied Robert Oppenheimer, who was the father of the atom bomb, which had been invented at Los Alamos. And I did academic work on that. And then just a couple of years later, the director of the Los Alamos laboratory, which was the third successor to Oppenheimer, gave me a personal services contract to be a strategic planning contractor to him, a strategic planning consultant. And I found myself in Oppenheimer's office at Los Alamos doing weapons research. And I was kind of stunned because I wasn't really qualified for that work. It was just a series of kind of random events, the type of surreptitious things that happened, this, and this. And then there I am in this office doing this research. I had that job for about a year. And then a couple of years after that, I left my job. I took a sabbatical from my job and I decided to travel around the world. And I ended up in Haifa in Israel, coming as a peacemaker. This was 1983. And I met up with some people who were doing a pilgrimage to Bethlehem. And that had been led by the priest who had been the chaplain for the plane that dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima.
Oh, wow.
So I ended up walking on this pilgrimage together with a lot of other people, but we walked through the West Bank in Palestine. And then on Christmas Eve in 1983, we walked into Bethlehem. And the shepherds are still in the shepherd's field. And the little town is still there. It's under Israeli occupation at that time, as it is now. And we did a service there. And so I kept connecting these dots with Cambridge, where I had been a founding member of the Cambridge Peace Commission. Cambridge was where Isaac Newton was from. It's actually also where Robert Oppenheimer, where he got his PhD, was at Cambridge University. And these things just all started threading together for me. And so I became active as a peacemaker during the 1980s. I worked with refugee youth. I worked with inner city youth. I did peace exchanges. I traveled, led delegations of young people. We hosted delegations. And so
that was part of your actual work, not your volunteer work on the side, right?
This was all volunteer work because I had my
Okay.
job. I had a paid job. So I was working, I owned an engineering company that did
Okay.
energy conservation engineering. And then I did this, all this volunteer work. So, but it was where my heart was. And I did that. And then eventually in the late 1990s, we sold the company to a natural gas utility. And I then decided I wanted to combine the two interests. I wanted to make my paid work in alignment with my volunteer work, kind of bring them together. And that this is what brought me. It didn't bring me immediately to Family Constellations. It brought me to looking for the missing tool in the Peacemaker's toolkit. And I didn't know what it was.
In the Peacemaker's toolkit. And you didn't know at the time what that was.
I didn't know what it was, but I didn't want to invent it. I wanted to find it. I had a sense that it was out there in the world, and I wanted to find it because by that time, after being a peace activist for 20 years, I had really covered a lot of the possibilities of peacemaking in terms of politics and economics and education and religion and spirituality. And I'd worked with young people, and I had worked with Holocaust survivors, and I worked with in the inner city, and I was involved with racial issues, and I had worked with in therapeutic containers, in psychology, and working around parents and children, and husbands and wives, couples. Now there's husbands and husbands. Back then there was only husbands and wives, but now it's anybody, love partners. And I knew there was a missing tool, and it was big, and I didn't know what it was, but I knew all of that. When you all added it all up, it all lost energy when it was needed the most.
It all lost energy when it was needed the most. What do you mean by that?
You bring together, we're going to do a peace seminar between Israeli peace activists and Palestinian peace activists. And we're going to do a 3-day seminar to bring them together. And the first night they come in and everybody's kind of nervous and they don't trust each other. Then they start doing the sharings and people talk about their experience, and then they start crying. Then they start hugging. And then the second day, they start creating their vision for a new world, and they put everything on the table, and they come up with their plans for how they're going to be able to live it together in peace. And by the end of the third day, when the thing is ending, they're all pointing fingers and screaming at each other, and saying that they'll never work with each other and feeling betrayed.
So at some point, the opposite polarity comes up and sort of tarnishes what was being built on the positive side up until that point, kind of thing.
Right. And there's no tool to deal with that. It just unravels.
So you basically sit there powerless, trying to hold it, and you couldn't hold it, and it just sort of unraveled from that point. That was your experience.
Right. And you could say in couples therapy, you could do it in between blacks and whites, you could do it in Northern Ireland, but it's the same dynamic occurs. That the tool that you're looking for works great until that moment of truth where it's really needed, and then it doesn't exist.
Your work is reminding me of a film that's 20 minutes long called Admissions. I don't know if you've seen it.
Mm-mm.
I'll have to share it with you later, but basically was inspired by a peacemaking group that it seems to, since the 1800s in the US Congress, there have been efforts by lawmakers to institute a National Department of Peace, which would be an equal footing with the Department of War. And it would be tasked with resolutions in a peacemaking route. But there have been so many efforts in Congress to actually pass this bill, to create this department, and all of them have been unsuccessful. But it's a 20-minute film that I will actually put the link in the description of this video for those that are watching so they can click. It's on YouTube. It's 20 minutes. It touches on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but it's very beautiful. I do not want to spoil it, so I do invite you to watch it because it's 20 minutes long. It received several awards, and there is a very famous actor who is one of the main characters in it. It all takes place in one room, but it's fascinating.
Cool. I'll check it out.
Yes, Admissions it's called. Okay, so in your search for that tool that would resolve that 3-day process you just described in a way, where did you first come across? Like, before you got to constellations, where did you, uh, you know, dip your toe before?
Well, I left my job and I basically didn't want to get another job until I found the tool. I had a little bit of money for the sale, not a huge amount, but walked away with uh, enough cash from that I didn't have to immediately get a job. I could go a little ways, and I just started looking. I read books. I went to workshops. I met with people that I thought were doing interesting work, and it wasn't until I received an email about a family constellation workshop that was occurring in South Dakota, that there was a German, Heinz Stark, who was leading a 3-day workshop in Rapid City, South Dakota, with descendants of pioneers and Lakota people. And he was looking at reconciliation between the groups. And I read that description. It was the end of November, a very cold time of year. And I decided I wanted to check it out. So I flew out there and did this workshop. And the first hour, when I sat down, I thought, "Oh, this is what I'm looking for. This is it." But
Your intuition told you I've arrived.
Right. But people on the street used to grab you and get you to take a Scientology test, or,
right.
Jews for Jesus, or all these other things that are out there. So I don't dive in, the first hour to anything. I'm very, I check it out for a long time, but I did think this is it. And so, and then by the end of the 3 days, I thought, wow, this is what I've been looking for. And I came back home. Bert Hellinger was doing an English language, a 7-day English language program in Germany. I flew out to that. I participated in that with him and a number of other trainers. It was all in English, even though most of the people were German. And then Susie Tucker was offering a year-long training with Bert Hellinger in New York, starting the following fall. And I signed up for that. And then I also enrolled in a PhD program at Saybrook University, because I wanted to have an academic background as well to be able to do this work. So that was the beginning of my Family Constellations journey. And I could say 20 years later, the work just keeps getting better. A lot of things, really wear out, marriages and recipes and, different things, kind of decay over time. But the constellation work, the work keeps getting better. I keep learning more. It's a big universe out there. There's no, it is a vehicle for exploring the mysteries of human existence at the physical and the spiritual and the ancestral, kind of the quantum level. And once you go in there, there's no end to what you can learn. And in terms of developing skills, it's like a musician that, as long as one's capacity maintained, you can keep getting better at it, indefinitely.
In constant transformation.
Yes.
And so your PhD work at Saybrook University, was it already geared towards getting a better understanding of family constellations specifically, or in general, in psychotherapy in general?
Well, I wanted to get a PhD in family constellations. I wanted to learn the background, and I wanted to do research about constellations. And I also wanted to get some training in psychotherapy. The psychotherapy training I got exposed to, but the two approaches are so different from each other.
Right.
That, I had professors there that told me I shouldn't be a therapist. And
why?
It's a lot of the therapy is about listening to people and confirming their problems, like that they're heard. They can feel heard. They can learn about themselves and understand like their own inner process. In family constellations, there's kind of a given that your own understanding is not going to get you anywhere. If it was going to get you anywhere, it would have by now. that
Right.
you to be able to move beyond the problem. Don't keep confirming the problem. Actually look kind of outside of yourself for a perspective that you haven't seen already and create a shift. And the constellation is designed to disturb people's
Mhm.
existing narratives, not to confirm them.
Exactly. It's what my husband says. He's a physician also. He says psychotherapy explains, family constellations resolve.
Yes, exactly.
And so it's so during this time, Dan, that you're doing your research into family constellations is when this book is born. I carry
Yes,
my heart, family constellations in prison.
yes. I had
Okay.
to, I needed to do research for the PhD, and I had already completed. I completed the facilitator training years before I completed the PhD. The PhD took me 6 years, and the training was 1 year. So I set out as a facilitator, and what I discovered was that nobody wants to do a family constellation. That there was no one had ever heard of it.
Mm,
Um, it's just all sounds strange. The whole idea that somebody's problem today that they're dealing with has something to do with their grandmother and their grandmother and their grandfather. There was something that happened to them, and now it's showing up in your life. That was just garbage to people. The idea that you're going to sit in front of a group of strangers and you're going to disclose some secret, and then the strangers are going to stand up and they're going to disclose some other secret about your life that maybe that you don't even know about, and the whole thing's going to go 45 minutes, and then you're going to bow to your mother. There's so many things that are
right.
repulsive.
To an individualistic American society of the 20th century, right?
So I was getting nowhere with that, and I spoke to a person I know, and they told me about this other person that led a group in prison. Every Saturday, went in and did a group in prison. I called that guy. He said, "Yeah, come on in. We're always looking for facilitators." And I went in there, and I introduced myself to the prisoners, and they're like, "Well, show us what you got."
It's at the
And
Bay State Correctional Center, right?
right, it doesn't exist anymore. They shut it down. That's why I don't go there anymore. I'd have gone there basically forever. I couldn't have stopped, but they repurposed the building and they moved the inmates out. Um, but I
And it
just
was a
started.
group of volunteers, right? That we used to already do some work with those inmates, right?
Right. There was an ongoing group, and I was joined to facilitate, and then people started hearing what I was doing, and started coming in. Women mostly, some men, but women would come as volunteers to participate with the group. And so I did this for 12 years. Every once a month, I would
Once a
go in.
month on a weekend with many volunteers who would be there to be representatives in constellations of many of the inmates who were willing to share or work in that setting with you, right?
Right. There were usually two, three, four volunteers would come in with me, and then eventually people would start coming in to receive a constellation, to be the client, because they heard that the inmates were such good representatives, and the space was so healing. We did there was a woman who was a professor at Harvard University who was married to a professor at Harvard University, and she was going through a divorce, and it got quite nasty. And she heard about our group, and she came in and to get a constellation for herself and all the feelings of shame that were coming up in her going through this divorce. So we had this experience of a client who basically was coming from the highest echelon of American society, who was working with a group of lifers in prison, which represents the lowest echelon. Uh, and and she was the client and they were the healers.
Beautiful.
And the constellation was it was just outstanding. The representatives were just totally in tune, brought in the resource beautifully, and it was transformational for her. I
It's
caught up with her years later, and she said she never forgot that experience, and it was a real turning point in her own relationship to getting divorced.
no, beautiful. And I'm going to put a link in the description of the video of where you can get this book online. It's very illustrative too, because you actually do diagrams and show illustrations of how the groups and the circles were standing and how the movements took place. And many of the stories that the prisoners themselves shared about history of abuse in their family, and how it seems that many of them ended up in that place not out of their own free will, but almost by virtue of the circumstances that they were raised in, right?
Right. And some of them, there's one of them that got out the last 2 years who had nothing to do with the crime that he was convicted of. He was just a Black teenager living in the projects, and there was a kind of a gangbang shooting, and the cops just they didn't really care. They figured, well, any one of them will do, and they just picked him up.
Wow.
And he served about 25 years. And then finally, there was he had some advocates, and they went back through the case, and they recognized that there was no evidence against. There was nothing, literally nothing, tying him to the crime scene. And he had an alibi, and they had no. They didn't have witnesses. They didn't have any physical evidence. They just the Boston cops were like, we got to send a Black kid to prison, and any one of them is just as good as any other. If this kid didn't do it, he did something else. So,
and I know that this prison closed in 2012. I think you said the building got repurposed, but through this work that you did there for so long, have you heard of other places that were inspired by this work you did and started doing their own interventions in different prisons or other places like that with Family Constellations?
there's an organization called the Jericho Circle, which works in a number of different prisons. They do shadow work, which is a little bit different. But there's a number of their facilitators have gone through some of my programs. So they're kind of Family Constellation knowledgeable. And there's a prison out in Wisconsin where one of our students, graduates of a program, runs a program out there for a medium security prison in Wisconsin. And of course in Brazil, through the work of some of the lawyers and judges in
Right.
Brazil. That's the place where Family Constellations is the most active in the judicial system. It's in Brazil, and it's much greater than it is in the United States. My book has been translated into Portuguese as well. So if you have
I do have a
listeners,
bilingual audience here. That I'll definitely put the link for both the Portuguese and the English version of the book. Thank you. Good reminder.
yeah.
So Dan, as we walk away from that period where your book was created, take us to the next step where you enter into what you call today, alchemical constellations. How was that transition?
Well, as I was working as a facilitator, I was collaborating with different other professionals, and I met a psychotherapist, Emily Blefeld, who was in Rhode Island, and she had a very busy practice doing psychotherapy. She worked for a lot of entrepreneurs, worked with people with ADHD, activists, and people who were actually successful in their lives, but they had a kind of an empty feeling inside that they couldn't quite fill. And we met, and I facilitated a workshop she attended, and she was kind of blown away. I did a very short process inside this other program, but she saw something she'd never seen before. So she reached out to me. She started referring some clients to me. And then one of her clients was too afraid to meet with me. So Emily sat in, and I just had her do a closed eye representation. And she closed her eyes, and she had the most kind of precise psychic image. It was just mind blowing. I had never seen anybody who could do this. she thought it was just, that's what happened when people represent. But she saw this image of a kitchen. She saw the chairs. She saw the upholstery on the chairs, what the table looked like, what his hair was like, the shirt that he was wearing, described the whole scene. And the client was like, oh my God, that's when I told my parents I was pregnant, in the kitchen at that table. And my father was wearing that shirt. And so we started doing more of those with these 3-ways. And her sight was incredible. And she's a brilliant therapist and just was very gifted. And very soon we just started doing them, these 3-ways, where she was co-facilitating. And then we, from that, we built a practice. We called it Seeing with Your Heart, and we created this practice together. And that was the big change. And then a couple of years went by. We're an intergenerational couple, but we fell in love.
Beautiful.
As well. And so we've been both work partners and life partners. And that's really the big change in my practice, was to be informed by a woman, a kind of seeing things from a woman's perspective that I never had realizations of. She could look and see how people were feeling, which was never a big concern of mine. Like to deal with the emotional content. I did my work. It's a little bit more like a surgeon, that the same things, the explanation and the resolution. So the surgeon's interested in the resolution, but the therapist is interested in the emotions and the feelings in a different way. So she brought in all this emotional content and awareness that I was not clued into. So it really elevated the quality of our work, and it kind of gave me an education as well. And it also built my psychic ability, kind of sitting next to her. So at this point now, I don't know what I had to begin. I had a certain intuition, but now I'm also, I can just close my eyes or stand, and I can do like a mediumship reading or channeling, whatever it is. I'm very fluid at that. And then I just kept pursuing my interest in alchemy, to understand what it was that we were doing and refine it through the lens of my interest in alchemy and kind of quantum science.
So you kind of go back full circle to your college professor who had the research into Isaac Newton's books on alchemy.
Yes, I feel that I have solved that mystery of the second, the second part of alchemy, which is the transformation of the heart. I can explain it, but kind of too complicated and technical. But I'll give it a chance for your listeners to try to explain it. The key to the alchemical constellation is that our individual life form, we are like paper dolls, and we are connected to all the life that preceded us. And there is an information flow along with the genetics. There's also information, emotion, memory that all gets inherited. It's not just the physical characteristics, which is kind of materialist science, but there is also an inheritance of emotion and memory and events that are held in our bodies and are entangled with ancestors. And what gets entangled is that when a person dies, this part, we can call it soul, but not in a religious sense, but there is a node of consciousness that is embedded in our bodies, that comes from the universe and it enters the body, and then when the body dies, it gets reverted and goes back into the universe and becomes a node of information in this vast field of consciousness. Sometimes when people die, the soul does not revert. It doesn't uncollapse in quantum terms. In the quantum terms, the infinite, there's a collapse of the wave field, and it collapses from the infinite into substance. But it then uncollapses and reverts back into the infinite. But it doesn't always happen. If a person dies in war, or if they die traumatically, or if they die with trauma, sometimes that gets caught on the earthly plane, and it gets transmitted through the generations as a disturbance. And so it can land many generations in the future. A living person literally feels in their body. Like a ripple. Mm-hmm. They feel anxious. They're afraid of fire. They sink into this dark depression. They feel like they don't belong. There might be a child who is just adored, a loving mother and father, loving brother and sister. The family is comfortable, and there's food on the table. And there's one child that feels that they don't belong, that can't receive anything, that can't take in nourishment, that is anxious about every little thing, or has outbursts of violence. And it doesn't make any sense in the context of the family. But you can look for the ancestor that they're entangled with and find the specific ancestor and the specific trauma that's unresolved at the ancestral level, and do a healing for the ancestor that allows that soul to revert, to leave the earthly plane, the plane of stuff, and to go back into the world of the infinite. And when that happens, the feeling immediately leaves the body of the entangled living person. And they feel it. They feel a great weight lifting off their shoulder. They feel this head to toe energetic release. And they become free. And the alchemy, the transformation of the alchemy, is that from the back doors of our heart, we are receiving shit from all of the things that happened. Our mother did this, our father did that, her mother wasn't there for her, her father died when she was 2, that man's father beat him and was an alcoholic. It's all this shit that just flows down from these generations. And it when it comes into our heart, the alchemy is that we turn it from shit into compost. And we're actually able to transform it into light, into love. The heart is the cauldron of alchemy that can turn what died and decayed, what was violent and bereft, and can transform it into nourishment for to grow life. And so what comes out the front doors of the heart is radiant light of love, fed by the shit that comes in through the back doors.
Beautiful.
And this is the alchemy of the heart.
You know, the image you drew reminds me of the Nile River in ancient Egypt and what they call the humus, which was the substance that would stay behind after the waters receded, which is the most fertile substance that provided food for an entire empire for many centuries. And it shares the root with the word humility. So this attitude of inner humbleness to actually look at shit, bow to it, respectfully, takes a certain level of inner humbleness. Otherwise the shit never is able to be transformed into compost and into light. It'll stay as the story, the shitty stories. What do you think?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, with that conference of the Palestinians and the Israelis. So the place where it breaks down is about the ancestors. So the Israeli and the Palestinian, they've worked it all out until one of them says, what about my grandmother who was killed in the Holocaust? And the other one says, what about my grandmother who still has the key to her house in Jaffa? And we want to go back. And the Israeli says, well, you're not going back. And the Palestinian says, I didn't kill your grandmother in the Holocaust. Why are you punishing me for what the Germans did? And then they're fighting with each other again. The healing movement is for the Israeli person to look back at their grandmother and allow the grandmother's tragedy to go into the earth and her soul to be released and for her to be set free and offer her blessings that he lives safely and beautifully without having to constantly be invoking her suffering as a kind of tyrannical victimhood that then allows him to dominate others. Right. And the Palestinian turns around and looks at his grandmother and can recognize this was a terrible loss. Let's her ceremonially be reunited on the land and her soul revert to her heavenly realm, and can recognize that the house in Jaffa they're not getting it back. It's not coming back. But we're still living on the land. This is still our home, and we're going to make a home for ourselves, for our children and grandchildren. We're going to make a home, and we're going to live with the other people that are here, and we're not going to say no to making peace with them because grandmother lost her home because there was an injustice done to her, that we're not going to, in the same way, inflict our tyrannical victimization onto the other because of some injustice that was done to them. We both had injustices in our family background. Neither one of us actually committed the injustice against the other, but we're here alive. Our children are here. And what we really want is just to be able to have a home for each other. And we're going to release our ancestors and receive their blessings. And we're going to find a way to live together without making the other one heal our ancestor. We're going to heal I'm going to heal my grandmother and you heal your grandmother, and then we can face each other.
Right. As opposed to unconsciously repeat the traumas of your ancestors by continuing to act out their traumas by living through all the wars and the conflicts that they lived through in this generation.
Right. You're going to kill me. You're going to drive me into the sea. And the other one says, you're going to screw me over again.
Right.
And here we are. It just goes on and on.
Keeps repeating. There's a sentence that you mentioned to me when we were preparing to have this episode, when you said you wanted to speak about the application of the observer effect to healing ancestral trauma.
Mm-hmm.
What is this observer effect that you're talking about?
Well, this comes from quantum theory. So there's a way that constellations can be explained in terms of quantum theory. I mean, it can be explained dozens of different ways. So this isn't, the explanation, but it's a framework for how this works. And it's consistent with quantum theory that the ancestor and the living person are entangled with each other. And this is the kind of the classic constellation work. So entanglement also exists in quantum theory, that two particles, when they're entangled with each other, one moves and the other at a distance also moves. And it's instantaneous and it's not dependent on distance. It's outside of space-time. So our unhappiness that's embedded in our body is entangled with an ancestor. And so we want to release the entanglement. And the way we do that, again, is invoking quantum theory. It's through the observer effect, because in quantum science, when something is observed, the observation itself changes what is being seen. So
changes the outcome, right?
It changes the outcome of it changes potentiality into actuality when it's observed.
Right.
So in constellations, when we have a living person and a representative, I like to do it. I usually do it closed eye. So we find the entangled ancestor through the constellation, whichever ancestor that is. The client closes their eye. In their mind's eye, they see that grandmother or great grandmother, whoever that story was, and they look at them with their eyes, and then they move their mind's eye into that ancestor, and then the ancestor looks at them. So they're holding these dual images in their mind's eye of seeing the ancestor and also being seen. And that is the observer effect. It is being seen. And when that occurs, the ancestor receives their release and the entanglement leaves the body of the living person.
Right. The being seen is a central part of constellations work, right, Dan?
Yes. Right. I see you, and recognizing, seeing. I mean, what I'm describing is innovative, but it is also goes right to the source of Bert Hellinger's observations. It's very consistent. It's not a change.
Right.
It's just a kind of reworking to make the work more accessible and understandable. And it also makes the facilitation easier. The thing I most like about it is the classic constellations. You really have to be good to do the healing movement. It requires a flash of insight that comes in the point where you don't know what you're doing. Exactly. And then you get a flash of insight, and it's intimidating. It's hard to train people, and it's hard to execute that. But this is actually simpler, and it's more reliable, and it's easier to teach, and it works very well.
And for people that have never participated in a family constellation workshop, the invitation is here to look up in your area if there is one going on, because to be in a group and step into a representation and experience the sensations, the thoughts, the feelings, it is quite a remarkable experience, because there's no prerequisite, there's no training required, there's no you have to read this before, you don't have to prepare. You just step into that field and you experience it. It's very phenomenological. And so I think what Bert Hellinger did was pretty much simply compile through his many hours of observation how the field worked. So it wasn't like he was dogmatically prescribing things. He was just saying, look, this is what I've observed. This seems to be the way it works. And let's test it. Let's test it, which is part of the refreshing aspect of the way you teach and the way so many other constellations facilitators teach, is that they themselves admit that before a constellation begins, they have absolutely no idea what's going to happen. And they've learned to be completely comfortable with that unknowing, and they just go in and let the movements follow. And like you said, a flash of intuition just pops in, and that's when you guide the healing movement for the client, right?
Right. We're working, we call it phenomenological. So if I know, we're kind of working in the realm of explanation, like you might do with an expert, a coach, or a therapist, who you tell them your sad story and they tell you what to do about it. Mm-hmm. But in this work, it's in the mystery, because you put in the representatives. They could be strangers, and they can tune in and access through these pathways of consciousness the entangled ancestor. And so it's actually revealed through the process of constellating. You can discover the entangled ancestor and then work with it. So there is a humility to it.
Right. And not just the entangled ancestors, but sometimes the trauma that's like a collective trauma, like war, or the bomb, or an event, or or immigration. So that can be the entanglement itself, right?
Right. Irish famine, Middle Passage, there are all types, Armenian genocide, of these collective catastrophes that
Nice.
also extend for generations.
Nice. I'm going to leave in the description of the video, everybody, the links where you can access Dan and Emily's practice, Seeing with Your Heart. But right now, Dan, I'm going to share the screen, and I want you to please speak a little bit about this upcoming event that you're going to be hosting in upstate New York, called Alchemical Constellations, a retreat for the living and the dead.
Mm-hmm. Oh, nice. This is November 3rd through 5th. It's at the Menla Retreat, which is a Tibetan retreat. It's operated by Tibet House, which was created by the Dalai Lama. It's a beautiful site. There's organic food, delicious, and it's there's two ways to participate. We have an online version where we have a whole leadership team, so there'll be facilitators online. There'll be a portion of it that will merge with the live group, and a portion of it that it will be all online, because a lot of people, it's a Zoom world now, and people are doing constellations without traveling, just zooming in. And then there's a live component where people will be staying on site at the retreat center, and Emily and I will be, there's a big, beautiful workshop space, and we'll be doing live work there. It's both of them, the zooming in is $95, so it's very affordable.
Right.
The 3 day is also affordable. It's $495. You have to pay for the lodging on top of that, but it's transformational. If you're carrying something heavy in your life, or just want to expand, to be able to make a movement for something that you really desire that feels stuck or blocked, Emily and I, and because I'm speaking with her, I can speak in superlatives. That the quality of the work is really superb. So I'd love to see people there.
Definitely. And I vouch for that from personal experience. And so, Dan, I wanted to end our conversation around the fire the way we always do, with an experiential opportunity for the viewer and the listener. And so, if there's anything that has occurred to you during this conversation that you'd like to leave us with as an experiential visualization, what would that be?
I'm going to do like a healing meditation.
Okay.
Take a couple of minutes.
Beautiful. So we're going to do a healing meditation. I'm going to invite everybody to get comfortable. I'm just going to get here some background music. I'll step out of the screen, and the floor is yours.
So I'm going to close my eyes. I invite you to close your eyes, unless you're driving, and I'll gather some images, and I'll share them with you from inside the meditation. So begin, just come into your body, feel your feet on the floor and the earth underneath your feet, and the chair holding you up, the breath in your body. And just make contact as you close your eyes and come into the quietness of your own mind with the place where you feel troubled, the recurring place of grief or regret or sorrow that seems like it dogs you sometimes. That in those quiet times of falling asleep or waking up, and other quiet moments, this feeling comes over you. Just make contact with it. And imagine that healing is possible right now. Set it outside yourself at a little distance. And imagine it's a small child, a sad child, a child that holds deep, deep regret for something that can't be undone, or fear that things will never get better. And put it a little distance from you so you can see it clearly, but it's beyond arm's length. And then imagine from the background, out of the dark, that there are healthy, loving ancestors coming to take that child. There may be some you know, maybe there's a favorite grandmother of yours. Maybe it's a brother or sister of yours who's passed, who you loved, who you supported, who supported you. And let them come not alone, but behind them come other ancestors. And they come on pathways of light. And they bring the light and they come to that child and they pick it up in their arms and wrap their arms around it and tell it it's going to be okay. And give it comfort and tenderness. It's not easy being human. It's not easy to be alive sometimes. We make mistakes. We make mistakes all the time. And not everything can be undone. But life continues, and every breath is a new possibility for something beautiful, no matter what has happened in the past. And allow that regret or that secret sorrow or that fear to be taken into the arms of the healthy ancestors. And light opens up behind them. And they sit in a big bath of light, and the light shines on you. Feel the light shining on you, pouring into you. It's the light of love of the universe. And it says to you that no matter what has gone on, that life is always renewing itself. Everything that dies is reborn. Everything that went wrong could be redeemed. And in the end, what awaits us is love. And you can, when it feels right, you can open your eyes and we'll come back together.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Thanks, Fred. It's been beautiful sitting with you. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, everybody. Dan and Emily at seeingwithyourheart.com. We thank you for watching this episode, and we hope to see you around the fire in the next episode. Take care.
Thanks all.